Okay, Linda, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the WAMO webinar, the lunch webinar that we have monthly. Today I have the pleasure of being able to introduce our speaker. So I'm Linda Weavers. I'm co-director of the Ohio Water Resources Center at Ohio State University. And today we have with us for our webinar is Dr. Andy May. He is an associate professor in environmental engineering at the Ohio State University. And Andy May, he has a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Delaware, a master's degree in civil and environmental engineering from Clarkson University, and a PhD in mechanical engineering from Carnegie Mellon. So he's kind of been collecting different engineering degrees along the way to his benefit and benefit of his science. Prior to joining Ohio State University, Andy was a postdoc at the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at Colorado State University, yet another kinds of different background. His research spans air emissions, fate, transport of pollutants. He combines laboratory experiments, field observations, and numerical modeling. He's also heavily involved at OSU in the undergraduate curriculum development. We've been doing some changes since the change to semesters and kind of cleaning up our curriculum and modernizing it. He's been leading these redesign efforts in both the civil and the environmental engineering programs at Ohio State for the BS program. So with that, and it might seem a little bit odd to have an air person to be doing a presentation to us today on WAMO, which is water, but it's PFAS, and PFAS is everywhere. And so he's going to be talking to us about the atmospheric fate and transport of the PFAS compounds and how they, the links to waterways and why he is here talking to us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Andy.
Thanks for that introduction, Linda, and thanks for the invitation to present. So like Linda said, we're going to be talking a little bit about this atmospheric fate and transport of PFAS. And I'm going to do my best to make connections to water, because that's what you all care about probably more than I do, because I'm an air person. Anyway, I like to start all my presentations with acknowledgements, so I'm not rushed to do this at the end. So there's a lot of people to thank that have contributed to some of the work that I'll be presenting. So on the left-hand side, some trainees, and so these range from undergraduate students to master's students to even a postdoc right now. At the top there, Jason Galloway is now a medical doctor. He's the one that really got this started off for us, I think. Then it's kind of continued from there. In terms of other collaborators, Linda's been one for the past, I don't know, 6 or 8 years maybe in this PFAS work. And then some folks from US EPA, someone from Lakes Environmental, someone from the Naval Air Warfare Center Weapons Division, which I'll talk about how that makes sense in context a little bit later. And then some external academics at the College of Worcester in Ohio and the Colorado School of Mines. And of course, the funding for this research, some of it's come directly through the Water Resources Center, but also be talking about an active project I have that's funded by USGS, and then something from the National Science Foundation. So just a brief outline of what we'll be talking about, kind of that standard background. What are PFAS? I'm assuming most of the people that are here know what that is, but if not, you'll get that context. We sort of did these 3 phases of field observations, so we're going to touch on each of those. But in between the first and second part of the field observations, I'm going to talk about some atmospheric transport modeling that we did. And then at the very end, kind of going to close with some laboratory experiments that we're currently doing. So, this is a talk that hits all 3 of those things that my group tends to do: the lab work, the field work, and the computational work. And so in terms of what PFAS are, there are these things that have been ubiquitous in our society. They're characterized by these compounds that are in the middle here. They have these carbon-fluorine bonds, and they have these favorable properties, right? Like they have these properties that make them water resistant or stain resistant, thermally resistant. These other things that the industries love to use them because they're great for creating their products. And with this graphic that Nisha, my postdoc, adapted from one in Australia, you can kind of get a sense of the variety of other different industries where they're used. But this is non-exhaustive because they're everywhere. They're used in lots of additional industries as well. But they're an issue because the exposure to PFAS has potential to lead to numerous health outcomes. And so I found this graphic that kind of summarizes some of it. That they could be neurotoxins, and they can disrupt different systems within the body, so the endocrine system, the immune system, reproductive systems, as well as target certain organs like the liver, kidney, and pancreas. So although that they have this great utility as in like manufacturing processes, they have this drawback of these negative potential health outcomes. And just for a sense of scale, like contamination is pretty widespread in the US. And so this map's taken from the Environmental Working Group, where they map these things. All the blue dots represent drinking water samples above the proposed limit, which with that map itself isn't very informative. But so I dug into that a little bit, and that's specifically the UCMR5 MCLs. And so that's a lot of the country, but you can also kind of see where a lot of the people are with this map too, that it's sort of densely packed in urban areas, because we as consumers are using these products, and we're producing these products, and it leads to this widespread contamination. Specific to Ohio, there's been a lot of testing in public water systems. And so this is a graph taken from an Ohio EPA portal where water treatment plants were sampled for PFAS. The gray dots were no detects. The yellow dots, which are kind of interspersed there, were below the action level. I don't actually know if there are any purple not sampled dots, but I guess the good news is that none of these dots represent something above the action level. But again, we've looked for it around the state. We found it in some degree in some locations. And so now we're kind of getting into that question of, why is this person with a background in air pollution presenting at WAMO? And so I'm going to try to do my best to convince you that it makes sense. And so some of the work that I'm presenting on contributed to risk modeling in the state of North Carolina. And so it basically considered this variety of observations over here on the left-hand side of the screen. Some physical characteristics like the depth of the well, some soil properties, but as well as, which direction is the wind going, how far is it from the fluorochemical facility, which in this case, if we're talking about North Carolina, that's Fayetteville Works. We added to this the predicted Gen X air deposition rate. So what's coming from the air and getting to the soil. And so on the right just kind of gives a sense of the spatial scale here. There are about 1,200 private wells sampled surrounding this site that were used in developing this model. And so what we saw in this, what's called a tornado diagram, is that predicted atmospheric deposition rate is the most important risk factor for influencing risk of contamination. And so the way to interpret this diagram is that the larger size of the bar implies greater importance in that prediction of risk. And so really those top three bars in this tornado diagram are all related to, I would argue, atmospheric transport. So what's our deposition rate? How far away is it? Which direction is the wind blowing? Kind of interesting that the soil properties and maybe how it moves through the soil once it gets to the surface are less important. Um, so yeah, that's sort of this connection back to the surface and how it can impact people is kind of the underlying motivation for my PFAS work. But I'd also argue that PFAS are an environmental, not just water issue, right? Like it's become a water treatment problem because it's maybe easy to identify these locations where we can treat PFAS in the water. But like water treatment plant operators are not putting the PFAS in the water; it's coming from somewhere else. I would argue that the origin of this PFAS problem is a waste management problem, and so that the graphic here is the waste management hierarchy. And down here towards the bottom is where that treatment step comes in. It's really, I think source reduction, the most preferable approach to waste management, is not really being achieved because we still have these releases into the environment. So with that preamble, we'll get into the story that I'm telling related to my research. And so this story really begins with the Washington Works facility in Parkersburg, West Virginia. It's the maybe the nexus of where this problem became identified for us as environmental scientists and engineers. And so it really started out with the work by Jason Galloway. So he was a pre-med student at Ohio State who was really interested in PFAS contamination near this site. And he collected some samples and he worked with those EPA scientists for analysis, as well as Linda. But these initial samples, which are shown on the map here, most of these were sort of downriver on the Ohio River from that site. Those samples weren't really that interesting. What was more interesting were these kind of upriver sites. And so just to orient you, if you're not familiar, the river flows kind of to the southwest in this diagram, but the prevailing wind direction is to the northeast. And so that's what's shown here in this windrows. These bars are basically showing us the direction the wind is coming from. And so the fact that we have these longer bars down here towards this southwest direction means that that's where most of the wind is going. So it makes sense that if there are air emissions, we'd see those more so in these upstream or these upriver yet downwind surface water samples. And so that's how I got involved, because he connected with me to see if atmospheric transport was a plausible explanation for this contamination at these upriver downwind sites. This wasn't really a new discovery. URS, which is now part of AECOM, and DuPont scientists postulated this, maybe about a decade before Jason did his studies. And so that's what we see in this cartoon here from a journal article publication where they included this figure. And so they're showing that we have these air emissions from our manufacturing facility. It can be transported by the wind, cross this river, come back to the surface, and get into groundwater, impacting wells. What we'd soon learn with Jason's subsequent work is that the extent of contamination of surface waters may be farther than the, really like 2 kilometers in real space that we see in this cartoon on the screen here. And so here we have the full set of samples from Jason's work. This little brace here is just giving you an indication of like this is about 2 kilometers scale. So near the source, we have these high concentrations still of PFOA for these samples that were collected, I think, in 2017 and 2018. As we move farther downwind, we start to see this gradual reduction in those surface water concentrations, but they're still pretty appreciable even as we're moving downwind. And again, we have this windrows here just to remind us that the wind is kind of going to the northeast on these figures. We also see this for HFPODA or Gen X, which is a newer chemical that's replacing PFOA, and we're starting to see a similar spatial pattern to that in the surface waters at the time of these samples. And so these are sort of strengthening that idea that atmospheric transport and subsequent deposition are impacting these surface waters. So we looked at these data a little bit differently. This is a log linear plot where we have distance on the x-axis and our concentrations on the y-axis. And we did this log linearly really to get a sense of, like, does it organize in a fashion that we'd expect to see in, say, a simple Gaussian plume model downwind from an air emission source. And the results are basically consistent with that sort of postulation. As we move farther downwind, there's kind of this exponential decay in those surface water concentrations, and we see that for both PFOA and Gen X. And so, in other words, there's this apparent lasting impact of the legacy PFAS, as well as an emerging impact for its replacement. The trends are slightly different, which may be more related to the specific PFAS and their properties, or how recently the deposition occurred. If Chemours is a good steward, they weren't using PFOA anymore, so it'd have a chance to sort of mobilize more in the environment, which may explain why some of those concentrations are relatively lower. But again, this sort of strengthens that idea that atmospheric transport can play a role in these surface water concentrations. So we moved on to conduct our own atmospheric transport modeling. Just kind of coincidentally, I had an incoming master's student, Angelica Moreno, who was interested in air quality modeling work. And so we ended up designing this master's project for her to model the atmospheric transport from the Washington Works facility there in West Virginia, as well as the Fayetteville Works facility in North Carolina. And, kind of long story short, we ended up with Dr. Jessie Tay on her committee, who is the president and co-founder of Lakes Environmental, which is the company that offers a variety of GUI-based air quality modeling software. So having Jessie join sort of this work was a great resource, because we kind of have this guru to give us some guidance of, are we configuring the model properly? Because at the time I had very limited software-based air quality modeling experience. We ended up using CalPuff View, in part due to Jessie's recommendation, but this is a puff model rather than a plume model, which we kind of see the difference here on the right. Considering this transport as puffs has an advantage when there's complex terrain, and so in southeastern Ohio, it's a lot hillier than it is here in Columbus. But the puff models can also account for, more readily at least, temporally changing meteorology. So when we looked at those windroses, the wind wasn't constantly blowing in the same direction. It was sort of changing over time. And so as inputs to this model, we had meteorology, we had some land use and terrain data, we had stack parameters that we took from a prior publication, and So we modeled both PFOA and Gen X in this exercise. Off the top of my head, I don't remember where we got the Gen X emission data. All of that fed into the CalPA view software, and we got our modeling outputs. But again, like, this modeling wasn't necessarily a new thing. Because of the interest in this region, lots of efforts had been made surrounding the Washington Works facility. And so what's on the screen is a figure from a prior modeling effort where they used a plume model. And so the plume use of the plume is a potential limitation, again, because of the terrain in this region. Something else they did, though, is they were just reporting air concentration. So each of those dots inside this green box represent the model air concentrations, which kind of tells us where it's going, but not necessarily what gets back to the surface if we're concerned with this in the context of water quality. They also considered a relatively short spatial scale. So I should have mentioned when I was talking about Jason's work, but he sampled up to about 50 kilometers away or 30 miles away from the site. The extent of this modeling domain that we're looking at now is about 20 kilometers downwind. And so I'd argue that spatial scale is maybe the main limitation of the prior efforts. While our field observations suggest there's this atmospheric transport impact beyond that distance of around 20 kilometers. And so what we're looking at now are modeled deposition rates from our CalPUF model from that source, or away from that source. And so there's 3 orders of magnitude of colors here. So the different colors represent different model deposition rates. The red colors here, you can basically tell where the source is because we have the highest deposition rates. As we move, again, kind of downwind, we start to see these decreases in predicted deposition rates, which makes sense because we have more dispersion that's occurring as we go away. These markers on this figure represent locations where Jason collected soil samples. And so if we compare our predicted deposition rates to those observed soil concentrations, we see a modest correlation. The R-squared value is about 0.3, which isn't great, but it's, I would argue, decent for field observations compared with anything, because environmental data are often messy. And we also had a lot of assumptions in our model, but I would say this really kind of, further supports that concept that this atmospheric transport from the source influence those surface water concentrations. And so we may see a little bit of evidence in this in public water systems. This is an inset or a zoom of that map I showed earlier from Ohio Public Water System testing. Again, when there were detections, they're below the action levels. But we can kind of see this maybe transport pattern where in some of these public water systems, we see this detection below that action level, downwind from the source. I guess as a point of reference, this is the Caldwell water treatment plant that's about 50 kilometers downwind. So that was kind of the extent of our modeling domain. But one thing that sort of a feature of this region is that there are a lot of private wells. And so this is now a Ohio Department of Natural Resources map that that's taken from their water well database. And I apologize if it's hard to see on the screen, but these small blue dots on this map basically represent the locations of private wells. And I think for a lot of those private wells, we don't necessarily know what any issues may be related to PFAS. So that's a potential cause for concern if we don't know what's there. Something else that pops out is that this yellow dot up here that I'm pointing at is the Cambridge water treatment plant. That's about 100 kilometers downwind, again below the action level. It kind of follows this pattern of where the transport's going from that site in Parkersburg. But really what this raises to me is like, where should we test PFAS for drinking water sources? Like, our field observations and modeling efforts extended about 50 kilometers downwind. We don't really know the full reach of atmospheric transport for a given facility, or how far downwind is this potentially going to make an impact on concentrations in water, whether that's surface water or groundwater that we're using as a drinking water source. So new master student, Miranda McGurley, started. Her focus was passive air sampling of PFAS in southeastern Ohio. And so she deployed these, we call them flying saucer samplers because that's basically what they look like, at these sites that are within that southeastern Ohio region, extended up to as far as Byesville for one of those samples. And what we're looking at on the left, again, is that the predicted deposition surface. The pins basically represent where Miranda deployed these samplers, and the numbers represent the air concentrations of the Gen X compound in nanograms per cubic meter. Ignoring this, one of these samples in Barlow, the concentrations are all relatively low and constant, but there's maybe a few hypotheses about what's going on here. It's either successful air pollution control by the source, or maybe we're just kind of beyond the elbow of exponential decay, because this closest site is about 20 kilometers away. And so what I mean by that is, these are just kind of cartoons to illustrate my point. Earlier, when we were looking at Jason's surface water data, we had something like this, where we had a log scale on the y-axis, and this is just a simple x versus y is equal to negative x. So looking at that exponential decay, it's linear on the bottom and we have the log scale, but on the top, after we reach a certain point, our concentration profile is relatively flat. So maybe we've kind of missed all of this maybe more interesting stuff as our concentration's more decaying away with the transport. Also with Miranda's work, we're not willing to rule out analytical challenges in how we process some of these samples in-house. Relatively new LCMS at the time, it's possible that there were some challenges with the user, we'll say. But not to be discouraged, we followed a second follow-up campaign across the state of Ohio for suspect sources. And so here we're including not only like the industrial site, down here, this orange pin is the Parkersburg site. We're looking across the state as a whole. And so these efforts are being led by current master student Kai Moran. And he went through and identified these potential air emission sources for PFAS. And so that includes, again, the industrial manufacturing sites. Those are the orange pins. Wastewater treatment sites are blue. Green are landfills. And over here on the right edge is a hazardous waste incinerator in East Liverpool. And so as we're kind of going through and looking at this, we're ultimately focusing on the southeast half of the state, and that was more for like convenience, I guess. Like we knew we wanted to sample near the hazardous waste incinerator. We knew we wanted to return to that Parkersburg area. Kai's family actually lives in Dayton, so adding some of these southwestern Ohio sampling sites are easy. And so it just made our overall sampling plan simpler. Instead of going over the entire state, he just went to a portion of the state. One other thing to kind of highlight here with the sites that we're looking at, it's a waste management issue, right? Like it's originating from industrial manufacturing sites, but it's impacting our wastewater, our landfills, our hazardous waste, because those last three categories really are waste management, right? And as we're managing that waste, they potentially become a new source of PFAS to the air. In this case, we did some simple Gaussian plume modeling to predict where the transport may be from these, again, suspect sources. Unlike in southeastern Ohio, we didn't have some pre-existing deposition model. So I just wrote a simple script to do some simple Gaussian plume modeling for these locations of interest. I'll acknowledge there's a lot of assumptions that went into this model. We don't know the actual air emission rates. And so basically what we're looking at here, like normalized surface level concentrations. We also estimated like the equivalent of like a stack for something like a landfill, which is maybe imperfect. And we also used the climate normal for the wind speed and direction. And so basically that's just telling us what's a typical wind speed, what's the typical direction of that wind as it blows. Regardless, we use this modeling output to give us a sense of where to sample in the field. And as we're designing our sampling plans, we wanted to kind of follow the most probable location of the plume. And so for a site like this, which this is for the Jackson Pike wastewater treatment facility, we want to look in these areas of the yellower concentration. Those are the higher concentrations, and kind of follow that in that prevailing wind direction. Here's just another example of that for that hazardous waste incinerator near East Liverpool. That probably depicts this a little bit clearer. We identified some candidate downwind sites. That's all the pins here. Kind of to the northeast, that's the direction the wind tends to blow in Ohio, as well as this one upwind sample, just to get a sense of what's coming into the air from other sources upwind from that facility. We're trying to cover a larger spatial scale, including some near the source. In this case, we got about 20 kilometers downwind with these 7 or so downwind samples. To ease our site access, we focused on public lands for our sampling. So that's what the green polygons are. And so with a lot of this, Kai made requests to like ODNR. It's analog in Pennsylvania in this case, since this really sits on the state border. He worked with some county parks and some other public groups that manage these lands. So we weren't, trespassing on private property, but also being respectful to these public lands and asking for permission. Most of them said yes. Some of them had very small conditions to meet, which I'll talk about on the next slide. With these samples, we collected tree bark as a proxy for air samples and soil as a proxy for deposition. And so the one drawback to those passive air samples is that you need to mount them somewhere. And they're also finite in number without increasing the cost. And so Kai discovered we could use tree bark as this proxy, And bark concentrations have actually been shown not to be influenced by chemicals taken up by the tree roots. So we're relatively confident that these bark samples give us this estimate of like a time integrated air concentration um, for those samples. And doing this using the tree bark samples and the complementary soil samples, we're a little bit more nimble in terms of where we could sample. That's one of the reasons why Miranda couldn't get closer to Washington Works. We just couldn't get permission to sample closer with one of our passive samplers. And so as an aside, and here's where that condition that was requested that we meet, one of the agencies asked that we added a layer of clear water-based paint to the trees, basically to protect them after the bark sample is removed. So we're trying to minimize that impact of the trees. We did that everywhere as a courtesy, not just at those sites where we requested to. And so you can see in the graph, here's a picture of the bark sample collected from this tree. I'm not 100% sure where the bark was actually sampled from. So again, we're sort of minimizing the damage to the tree. The next image to the right, Kai freeze-dried and ground up these samples. And here's just some example of more steps in that process for analysis. The story here is really incomplete though. So those bark and soil samples are being analyzed by Dr. Pat Fedek and his team at NOC-WD. Historically, that Naval Air Warfare Center Weapons Division has focused on like munitions contaminated soils. But recently, because of issues with DoD and PFAS contamination, they've moved into PFAS. They've also developed some novel like field testing methods that they're interested in testing with our samples. We don't have those results back yet. We have a call with them next week, so more to come in the near future. Once we have those results, we can do the data analysis to really paint the picture. So like what's the spatial distribution of the concentrations? Are some concentration, like including like, are some concentrations negligible at some downwind sites? Like, can we sort of rule out certain sources being important for air emissions of PFAS? Again, we're sampling for these suspect sources. We're not 100% confident that all of them will return high PFAS levels. The last step is that we're hoping to use these results to evaluate CMAQ PFAS for Ohio. And so what CMAQ is the model that the US EPA uses in air quality forecasting. This is where that collaboration with Dr. Ben Murphy and Emma D'Ambro at US EPA comes into play, because the version of CMAQ that includes PFAS in the air transport kind of originated from that group. I hypothesize that the story is going to become complicated with respect to individual sources. And so here's two kind of snapshots of that first map that I showed of Kai's work. I think an urban area like Columbus could effectively be very complicated because it's more of an area source than a point source, right? Because there's lots of people, lots of other things that could potentially release these PFAS to the air. But also near Worcester, there's this cluster of these suspect industrial sources. And so kind of disentangling one source from another could be challenging because we don't know like the source profiles for many of these suspect air emission sources. So like what's being released. And we don't fully understand all the mechanisms, I would argue, for the atmospheric fate and transport of these PFAS. And so with that, we'll kind of segue into some lab work that we're doing. And so these lab efforts were to kind of probe thermodynamic properties of select PFAS. Specifically, we're interested in properties that will affect their phase in the atmosphere. Are they going to be present as a gas, as in the particle phase, or in atmospheric water, so like a cloud droplet, for example, and which of those phases favored? And so the first set of experiments we did was really looking at that gas particle partitioning piece. And so for these 7 selected PFAS, some of which were liquid samples, some were solid samples, and we're sort of focusing on PFOA, and some of these other compounds are its replacements. We also added trifluoroacetic acid as a fairly ubiquitous PFAS in the atmosphere, as well as this acyl fluoride of Gen X. We took those samples, added some to this crucible, placed that crucible in this thermogravimetric analyzer that's coupled to differential scanning calorimetry, and we could get the results that I'll talk about on the next few slides. And so these efforts were led by Dr. Nisha Sharma, and we had some undergrads who supported these efforts as well. And so what the thermogravimetric analysis shows us is that evaporation occurs with heating. So the x-axis here is the temperature of the sample. The y-axis is the amount of mass remaining in that crucible. And so I think we heated these at about 10 degrees C per minute in that instrument. Within the instrument, the sample is basically sitting on this analytical balance. And so we can see that as we're heating these samples, some evaporation starts to occur. And as we go left to right on this graph, the PFAS are getting less volatile. The main output from this data are the boiling point of the PFAS. I'll talk more in a couple of slides about why knowing the boiling point helps us. The other piece of the instrument is this differential scanning calorimetry, which tells us the heat flow associated with the evaporation. Evaporation is an endothermic process. So that's why these are all negative. If we integrate these curves, we obtain the enthalpy of vaporization, which tells us something about the energy required to evaporate these PFAS. And so again, just showing this for the 7 different PFAS that we're interested in. And so we use those experimental results to infer things related to the phase transition. So this is just a summary table. And so we got the boiling points from the thermogravimetric work, the enthalpies from that's differential scanning calorimetry, and using that, we can estimate the vapor pressure at 25 degrees C using a thermodynamic relation, because we know the vapor pressure at the boiling point is 1 atmosphere. And so these numbers may not mean anything to you, but really the physical interpretation is that if the activity coefficient of these organic compounds in an organic solution is greater than like 1/10,000th, the gas phase is favored. So again, these vapor pressures basically imply that between gases and particles in the atmosphere, the gas phase is favored. But it's not just the gas particle partitioning that's important, because we have atmospheric water as well. And so what this graphic here is showing is like, it's kind of like a PC-pH plot to some extent, where we're looking at where the PFAS is going as we change, in this case, the liquid water content. And so at the left-hand side of this figure, we're talking about like wet atmospheric particles. On the right side, we're getting more into like cloud water concentrations. And so you can see as that liquid water content changes, the distribution of where the PFAS are located change. And so this has implications for wet versus dry deposition. If the PFAS prefers to be in this aqueous phase, the wet deposition pathway is more favored. Otherwise, maybe we have a dry deposition pathway. Something about most of the, or all the PFAS that we've studied is that they're acids, and acids will dissociate in these atmospheric waters, which can effectively draw more material from the gas phase into that aqueous phase. I have my cells here at the question mark because something that we should have realized as we're doing these complementary solubility experiments is that these are all surfactants. And micelles form once you reach your critical micelle concentration. I don't know if micelles will form in the atmosphere. I don't know if we're hitting those critical micelle concentrations, but that's another potential complication about thinking about this phase. Also, chemistry may occur in the atmosphere. Yeah, I know these are not that reactive, but for these acids, people have shown that the hydrogen from the acid group can be abstracted. Of course, if we have a poly-fluorinated PFAS instead of a perfluorinated PFAS, there are more hydrogens for this reaction to occur. But also, like, as we move into different structures, like with ether moieties, there's potential for different reactions to occur at different locations in these species. And then lastly, in the condensed phase, the role of ammonia or ammonium may be important because ammonia is the most abundant basic gas in the atmosphere. So we could potentially form ammonium salts of these acidic PFAS that would alter their fate and transport properties. Sorry to get all atmospheric chemistry on you. Connecting this back to environmental PFAS, if we can quantify these physicochemical properties, we may get a better indication of how they return to the surface. We're doing some additional atmospheric chemistry experiments that I didn't have time to talk about today, but this can inform what to look for in the environment. And so on the right here is just an example mechanism of 8,2-fluorotellumer alcohol reacting in the atmosphere to produce, in this case, PFOA. This is a case where we know this reaction pathway because we know what the chemistry is. For a lot of these PFAS, if we're not studying the potential for the chemistry to occur and what products may form after long times, we may be looking for the wrong things in the environment. And of course, we need these properties to be quantified for accurate fate and transport modeling. And so really the takeaway points that if you don't leave with anything else, these air emission sources are myriad. There's potentially a lot of them. Again, it ties back to like waste management. These atmospheric processes impact the PFAS fate, and in combination, it affects the PFAS budget in terrestrial water and soil. And with that, I'll open the floor to any questions. Thanks for listening.
Andy, maybe I'll lead it off. There is a question that came into the chat from Licking County Soil and Water.
Okay.
It's a kind of a long question. So they are asking you, how would you suggest a community can be proactive? That they're in Licking County where Intel is coming in, and they're kind of want your ideas and thoughts. They are currently in Licking County is little air monitoring right now and no water quality sampling for kind of setting a baseline before things come in.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that gets a little tricky to some degree. Like, to my knowledge, regulatory agencies are not looking for PFAS in the air. I'm trying to remember though if we had any sampling sites in Licking County from Kai's work, which would give like a pre-Intel sense of what's currently there. So maybe this is sort of a non-answer, but maybe I need to follow up with you once we get those results back. And I realize like I didn't put my contact info anywhere in this talk, so I will drop my email address into the chat right now. But please let's follow up at some point regarding that, especially if we do have results for somewhere in Licking County. Sorry for not really answering the question though.
No, that is helpful, and I will follow up with you about that. Thank you.
Great.
Are there other questions for Andy? You don't have to put it in the chat. You can raise your hand and or just speak up as well. I guess I'll ask a question for you, Andy, and maybe this is scientific, but maybe it will help people think about this kind of unique sampling method that you're using by using tree bark as sort of a proxy of the air emissions. Do you have a knowledge or information on how far back in time that tree bark is capturing these compounds?
That is a great question. I do not know that answer. I would encourage you to ask Kai that during his defense, though. Well, I mean, but seriously, like I view it as sort of this more like longer term time integrated sample. And I guess like maybe to really get a sense of how long in time your sample is representing is maybe related to like how much of the bark you're cutting off and how fast. I don't know much about how tree bark grows, but I'd assume it's proportional somehow to like the thickness of your sample. And I don't remember how much bark Kai was cutting off with each sample. So in terms of estimating what that represents, I'm not 100% sure. I would assume that's in the literature somewhere, but I'm not familiar with where that is.
But it could be a nice way for to get a pre-event sampling of to then be able to look at changes with time afterward.
Yeah, like, and I don't like, and again, I guess on the post-event side, I don't know how long it would take to accumulate to some amount that is like above some detectable threshold. But yeah, I mean, it when he discovered that, I was like, yeah, that sounds like it's worth pursuing more. And he dug into the literature, and we got more convinced that this could be used as this. I mean, it's effectively like a screening tool. Like it's very non-regulatory, but it will ultimately give us this sense of what's in the air, where is it located spatially, with respect to these suspect sources. But again, like disentangling some of it from source to source could be difficult just depending on where you are. But if you do have a new major suspect source coming into a region, then maybe there's the probability of attributing something new to a new source is higher.
Are there any other questions for Andy? Well, with hearing nothing, thank you, Andy, for presenting on air things that are kind kind of a field from where most people that are on this webinar listening to you normally think about. So I think it's good to recognize that things are connected together and paying attention to the air, especially for the PFAS, where there's still a lot of learning going on. It is important for painting the entire picture of this PFAS problem. So thank you, and thank everybody for getting on today. Sarah,
thanks for having me.
any closing out things?
I just want to say thanks again to Dr. May and Linda for moderating today. Folks are asking about a recording of this. We did record this webinar, and it will be available on our educational videos tab for members on our website. If you have other questions about how to get the material, if you're not a member, please email me at wmaohio@gmail.com. And that should be it.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks.
Thank you.